Good afternoon, everyone. The House set to clear President Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion pandemic aid package today, providing an economic boost that will last long after those $1,400 stimulus checks start arriving in Americans' accounts this month. Here to unpack what to expect today and, more importantly, what comes next is Bloomberg congressional reporter Anna Edgerton, Bloomberg economics and policy correspondent Michael McKee, and Bloomberg opinion senior columnist Tim O'Brien. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us. Anna, I want to start with you. We know this is passing today. The big question on many American minds is when people start receiving those stimulus checks.
Yeah, the answer to that is as soon as possible. And the IRS has done this before. They went through this exercise last year, although it's not going to be quite as quick as the last round of $600 checks because it has to go through a new system this year. So those checks will go out as soon as President Biden signs the bill, which we expect to happen by the end of this week.
Tim O'Brien, come on in here. I want to talk a little bit about how this is being spun politically here. Kevin Cirilli on our show earlier today saying that his sources are telling him that this is going to be considered by the White House as President Biden's crowning achievement within his first 100 days. How do you see Democrats spinning this, and how do you see Republicans spinning it?
Well, it is a sizable achievement regardless of who's spinning it. It's a major piece of legislation. It is part, if you account for everything that's occurred on the fiscal side over the last year, it is the most muscular rescue effort by the government in U.S. history. And I frankly think there could have been more here. But at least it puts a big stopgap in an economic dam that I think was showing serious fissures and would have caused greater long-term damage if something hadn't been done to shore up average consumers and people in poverty. We've talked about this before, Tim, but I think you can put moral and social justice issues aside and remember that 70% of GDP comes from consumer spending. If the consumer starts to stumble, the economy will as well. And this is an important stopgap in that. Additionally, last year, Republicans rushed to get the CARES Act passed. There was a lot of money given to corporate America as part of that. There were arguments at the time that it was simpler. We made them ourselves to use the bankruptcy process rather than bail out companies. But that was considered too abrupt and brutal. I think we should have the same point of view towards people who are struggling alongside corporations.
So on that note, Tim, that you said that you think there could be more in here, there are some concerns that the bill is too much. When it comes to inflation, Michael, we haven't seen that yet. U.S. Council of Economic Advisors member Jared Bernstein was on Bloomberg TV a little earlier today. Take a look at what he had to say.
The plan itself spends out over a couple of years. So some of the folks on kind of the overheating team don't recognize the spend out pattern. Then there's slack, okay? There is still way more slack in this labor market. And then, of course, savings. That, too, puts downward pressure on price pressures.
Okay, so basically he's saying don't be concerned about inflation. What are the data telling us, though?
Well, the data are not in yet on this package, but we did see inflation come up after the last packages were passed. We are going to get inflation because the months of March, April, May last year, inflation went away. We had deflation for those 3 months. And mathematically, those months fall out of the calculation. And so there will be a jump in inflation without even this package taking place. Now you're going to add more stimulus into it. Plus, gasoline prices are rising, we know. So there are going to be some inflationary months. Now, the question is, how much of the demand that is going to arise, particularly out of these checks, is going to arise quickly enough that we have shortages of goods, supply chain problems that then push up prices. And that's what we don't know because we've not been in this situation before. As Tim mentioned, savings is huge. We're at a 20% savings rate. Do people start spending that down as well? A lot of this is going to depend on the virus and when people feel comfortable about going out and spending again. When do you want to sit at a restaurant? When do you want to get on a plane and go on vacation? So until we know that, we won't know how much money spent will be in a very short period of time enough to cause an inflation problem. The Fed is betting it will take a long time. About 1 to 1.1 trillion of this will be spent in 2021, though. So it is a lot of money.
So, by the way, I think I'd be feel safe sitting in a restaurant or flying on a plane 2 weeks after I get that second dose. That's what I think at this point, though. I'm not there yet, so we'll see. Can you just take a step back and explain why investors are scared about inflation, why Americans really should care about inflation?
It's an interesting question because I grew up in the generation where everybody was terrified of inflation because once it gets out of the bottle, it's very hard to put back in because the Fed said, as the Fed says, they have the tools to deal with it, which means they raise interest rates and generally they send the economy into a recession. And we really don't want to go back into recession. But if you get inflation up too high, it erodes the value of everything that you have and the purchases you're going to make, and it makes your salary worth less. And so we try to avoid that. And that's been the good thing about the last 40 years of inflation has just come down and down and down. Can it come back? Well, Jared Bernstein and other people argue it's going to be very difficult, as does the Fed, because the economic dynamics have changed. You've got globalization, you've got the Amazon effect, and you don't have the labor union pressures anymore where they see prices going up so they demand higher wages.
So Anna, come on in here and talk a little bit about that, because we do hear about the $1.9 trillion price tag on this package. It's something that obviously Democrats are proud of what's in this bill. But what are your sources in Washington telling you about what comes next? What comes next when it comes to infrastructure, how they're thinking about moving this forward?
Yeah, it's been interesting to talk to members of both parties because Republicans will say this is too much. Republicans had offered a $618 billion bill instead of this $1.9 trillion bill, saying that all of the stimulus money from the last round still hasn't been spent, so we don't need to spend that much now here at the end of the pandemic. Progressives, however, have said $1.9 trillion is great. $1.9 trillion is great, but we need to do more. And that's when they're looking forward to that next package. And this is going to be Biden's Build Back Better plan. That's going to include infrastructure, could include some health, childcare, education provisions as well. And that's going to be the really kind of, the last train leaving the station, so to speak, in Biden's first half of his administration. And that's where we're going to see a lot of push from progressives for the really big ticket items in all kinds of issues, especially things like infrastructure.
Hey Tim, when we think back to the last time the U.S. faced a recession as deep as this, or the last time in our lifetimes in recent history that the U.S. faced a struggling economy similar to this, not like this, similar to this, the wake of the financial crisis. I wonder what the Biden administration and what then Vice President Biden learned from 2008 and how we're seeing that manifest in what he's doing right now.
Well, I think there were two important lessons they took from 2008, one on the political side and one on the fiscal side. On the political side, Obama came into his presidency very keen on bipartisan legislating, and I think it was authentic. He tried to do it. It collapsed around a number of things, including the passage of Obamacare, but around TARP and some of the other relief efforts at that time, they certainly ended up trying to tailor that bill towards bipartisanship, I think, rather than towards economic efficacy. And I think it was said at the time, and I think there's a broader concurrence around it now, that much, much more could have been done on the fiscal side to right the economy. We ended up creating a regime in which central bankers, not only in the United States, but globally, had to use interest rate policy to stimulate economies, which is not the normal role for central bankers. And I think Biden was obviously at a front row seat to that. Obama had him run important parts of the bailout. And I think his team recognized this time around that you had to go big, and that you also had to, if push came to shove, punt bipartisanship in favor of ramming legislation through. And obviously that's what's happened here. I think there was some token efforts to make this a bipartisan effort, but it ended up being pushed through as a reconciliation process.
Yeah, and it really shows the importance of that special election in Georgia as well. Hey, Anna Edgerton, I'm wondering about some specific parts of this bill that move beyond pandemic relief, specifically elements related to the child tax credit. What do you see in here that could really push the needle when it comes to economic inequality and trying to solve that in the U.S.?
Yeah, this is a really important point for progressives who have said that this this legislation will cut child poverty in half. And the vehicle for that is, as you said, the child tax credit. It's a temporary tax credit in this bill. Democrats are looking to make that permanent. So if that is made permanent, that's more than $1 trillion price tag for just that piece of legislation. So, this is something that would basically kind of be like a universal basic income for families with children. And that's something that Democrats have said would help inequality, would help child poverty. It would really kind of like lift up the bottom half of America, as we're seeing kind of divergence between the people who are already doing well in this country, doing even better after the pandemic. People who are already struggling are in even worse shape. This is one of those provisions that Democrats say could really target the lower half and kind of even out some of the inequality that has gotten worse during the pandemic.
So even though Democrats do really push hard on this idea that this is targeted, that this is going to benefit people who really need it the most, one common pushback that we hear from Republicans is that this is too much. There is too much money in this bill. Too much money is being spent. When are we going to know who's right on this? When are we going to know if it is too much?
It's going to be a very long time. We don't know at what point the market is going to back up and say, no, we won't digest all of this debt that you're selling, and when interest rates are going to go up and by how much, because then the U.S. budget deficit will get even worse. So it's kind of hard to know at this point. And you have this whole modern monetary theory idea that if you have your own currency, you've got a printing press, you can print as much as you need, you don't have an issue unless you get inflation. I don't think most people believe that, but they do believe part of it, that you can run much bigger deficits than we ever thought. The argument is you grow faster than the deficit grows and you can keep paying your bills. And so it's going to take a long time before this really starts to have an impact. And the idea of the Build Back Better plan is we can boost growth a lot with this American Rescue Plan, but it would be only short-lived. Coming out of the Great Recession, the ARA plan boosted growth in 2009-10. We came out of recession, but then we never really got faster than 2%, 2.5%.
And that was a huge issue.
And that was a huge issue for 10 years. And the idea is if you can improve the infrastructure of the country, and by that I don't just mean roads and bridges, but the internet and all kinds of things like that, then you will be able to increase productivity, which is one of the components of increasing potential growth. And then the economy can grow faster and we can absorb all this debt.
So there's obviously the political question in here, Anna Edgerton, about 2022. How does this affect the midterms? And I can't believe, it just feels like we just went through an election cycle, so I can't believe I'm already asking you about this. But look, there are political implications to this. Is this something that candidates are going to be talking about, whether they're Democrats or Republicans in 2022, or is it moving on, or is this too far back?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's always election season, so always a fair question. It's been interesting to hear the Republican speeches on the floor going on right now in the run-up to this House vote. And they are, like we said, making the point that this is too much money, that this is not what needs to be spent kind of at the end of the pandemic. And one point that I would like to make is that going the reconciliation route is fast. It was faster for the Biden administration to just kind of use whatever parliamentary procedure to get this through with just Democratic votes, but that makes it very hard to defend. When you look at other big pieces of legislation that have been passed using the same process, you have the Republican tax bill in 2017 that was passed through reconciliation using just Republican votes, and that really hurt them in the midterm election because Democrats were able to cast that as something that just was a benefit for rich people and corporations. When you look at the Affordable Care Act, that was passed through reconciliation with just Democratic votes, and Republicans spent years trying to repeal and replace it. So, these big partisan projects are good for the party and that they have an accomplishment they can point to, but it's also very easy for the other side to demonize as just kind of, a partisan priority that was rammed through without really consensus of the American people.
Hey, Tim, every time we have you on Quick Take, I want to just get your take on the temperature of what's going on in the Republican Party. Earlier this week, we learned that Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri is not going to seek re-election. This is the 5th GOP senator who will not run again in 2022. Is this a sign that the Senate is becoming, and the Republicans in the Senate is becoming truly the party of Trump, or is there a chance for the Republicans to move away from Trump?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I certainly think there's, and this has been going on for years now, I think there's senior Republican legislators who don't feel they are part of this new world of red meat, pitchfork and torches Republican politics, and some of them are older, but I think there is. I think some of them don't have the energy or see a place for them in this particular fight, and they're moving on. I don't think it's been resolved yet in terms of what the identity of the GOP is going to look like coming out of the Trump presidency. You saw this week in his own fisticuffs with the GOP over campaign finance and using his image that he wants to remain center stage on fundraising. He certainly wants to remain center stage as the identity of the party. 30 million hardcore Republicans support him. 74 million voted for him. I think the party's going to continue to have an identity crisis for a little while.
Bloomberg's Anna Edgerton, Michael McKee, and Tim O'Brien. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We're going to have to leave it there. Really appreciate your time.